we're living in an America divided. And as Republicans and Democrats trade partisan attacks back and forth, members of the right and left are retreating further into their corners. When it comes to support for Donald Trump, there is a stark divide along party lines. The latest Gallup poll found a whopping 90% of Republicans approve of the job the president is doing. Just 10% of Democrats feel the same way. And for Trump, the feeling is mutual.
We're having a lot of problems with Democrats. They don't want to vote for anything.
My next guest predicted much of this in one of my favorite books, What's the Matter with Kansas, talking of working-class Americans voting against their economic self-interests. In his latest, it's called Rendezvous with Oblivion, Reports from a Sinking Society, author and historian Thomas Frank dissects a decade of relentless capitalism and the wave of angry populism that drove the 2016 election. Calling today's divide, quote, what a society looks like when the glue that holds it together starts to dissolve. Thomas Frank is also a columnist for The Guardian. He joins me now. Great to see you. How are you?
It's great to be here.
So before we get to your book and your essays and that sort of stuff, we were just talking about Huckabee Sanders being asked to leave that restaurant in Alexandria a week or two ago on the Tonys. Robert De Niro did the FU to Donald Trump. Are you okay with this, or is this another example of the Democrats / the never-Trumpers just not getting it?
Well, I'm fascinated by it. I mean, this is like the Vietnam era all over again, only minus, the Vietnam War. It is fascinating to me to see how quickly and how superficially liberals have been radicalized in the last couple of years. To the point where, I sometimes feel like I'm the last, I'm considered like way, way, way to the left in American politics, but sometimes I feel like I'm the last centrist out there,
Speaking of liberals and when they get it, most liberal experts you talk about say it's bigotry. That's what propelled this guy into the corner office, into the Oval Office. And then what you decided to do is I guess, a little binge watching of some, that's a fair way to describe it, of some Donald Trump speeches. And
yes.
What did you learn from those, Thomas Frank?
Well, I was surprised because up until then, look, let me take a step back here. Donald Trump, by my reading of him, is a bigot. And Donald Trump, in fact, represents everything that I dislike in the world. Just about. He has an almost perfect record, with regards to me. But when I sat down and watched, many, many hours of his speeches, this is in about March of 2016, I discovered that the guy talked about other things as well. And yes, the bigotry was there. But then there's this, by far the most obsessive subject for him was trade. And he talked about trade not in the way that a Republican ordinarily would, talking about free trade, but he was complaining about the bad trade deals. And it sounded like the kind of stuff that my friends at the AFL-CIO would say. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was sort of swiped from these like left-wing talking points. It was fascinating. And we now understand how central that was to this guy. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the bigotry of Donald Trump. All I'm saying is that
explaining the appeal.
There's something broader to this guy. He's up to something that we shouldn't just brush off.
For those who don't remember those thrilling days of yesteryear, here's one of those speeches I'm guessing he watched that night. Here it is.
We as a country are being ripped off. We are being ripped off by virtually every single country in the world.
We're going to take our jobs back. We're bringing our manufacturing back.
If we don't get the deal we want, we'll leave NAFTA and start over again, and we will make much better trade deals.
And people bought it to a great degree. I mentioned
but I should interrupt. Obama promised that too. People don't remember this anymore. But in 2008, he promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and then never happened.
With What's the Matter with Kansas, which I mentioned to you when I saw you a couple of minutes ago, is one of my favorites, and Marjorie Egan and I cite it all the time on the radio. You could have entitled this, or at least the Trump portion of this, What's the Matter with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan? Could you? Almost nothing has changed in terms of that analysis.
It's gotten worse.
Explain the basic thread through that.
The idea is this kind of, What's the Matter with Kansas was about working class conservatism. So about when working class, specifically white working class people, get mobilized on behalf of politicians and a form of politics that only does them harm in the end. And Trump is the sort of the limit case. This is the most extreme. Actually, the Tea Party would be the most extreme case. But that's what is going on in this country now. It's in some ways it's the flip side to all the hope you saw for Obama in 2008. It's that hope curdled, and it's become a kind of desperation. And here's this guy promising these things. And by the way, and Trump promised outrageous, preposterous things that he clearly has no intention of delivering on, but things that sounded very good to people who are watching their way of life fall apart around them.
You know, but you also, in your book, one of the essays here, you mentioned that the Democrats still don't get it. And you talk about their obsession with these moderate swing voters in the suburbs, how they're going to turn the trick in 2018 or 2020. But it's those voters that you were just describing in all those states who that make that case if you can.
But this is so obvious to me, and I've been saying it for 20 years, that the swing voters in American politics are not the affluent I mean, that might be, they might swing a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. But the ones to look out for, the ones who have changed our politics since the days of Nixon, are the white working class voters that have by and large migrated away from the party of Franklin Roosevelt and migrated over to the party of Donald Trump. And we see that process now close to a state of completion.
And why have the Democrats failed to acknowledge what I consider to be the obvious, what you're stating? Is it because they're just more comfortable with the people at the top who you criticize
that's one way of putting it. That's what I talk about that in Listen Liberal. It's a kind of sociological study of who the Democrats are. And a two-word answer for that is Martha's Vineyard. You know what I'm talking about? But an even simpler answer is, why won't they do it? Why can't they see this? Because of money. It's like to understand what is happening to them, this long-term process, and to do something about it means breaking up with their donors.
But it's not just money. You basically make the case that journalists are collaborators in this effort with the Democrats. Why? I think you say that journalists hate economic populism, is I think what you wrote. Why do we hate economic populism?
Journalists these days, the people who are left in journalism are all drawn. I'm talking about the Washington Post and New York Times here. Tend to be drawn from a very specific, and we're in Boston, so I can talk about these things, a very specific social milieu. They tend to, so basically what I did is I talked about the professional class and the professional managerial, people with advanced degrees, affluent white-collar people, and that's who the Democratic Party is these days, and no surprise, that's also who journalists are these days. And so they see eye to eye with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is basically a party for a social class these days, and it's a very affluent class.
We have a minute left. So is the path out of the wilderness, which you also write about, just realizing who you got to go get, or it's message change, too, in a big-time way?
It's both, and it's a third thing. It's stopping Trump. Trump, and remember Steve Bannon, had this grand dream of making of basically cementing right-wing populism as the ruling sort of ideology of the Republican Party, and that seems crazy to me, but they're doing it.
So give me two concrete things before we go the Democrats tomorrow should embrace and act upon. I assume it's the Warren-Sanders agenda. Is that... No?
Yeah, in general, but they need to take a lot of these issues back away from Trump. It's tough now because they've lost both houses of Congress. They've lost the presidency. They're defeated across the country. They need to start rebuilding almost from the ground up.
What should they focus on?
But I should say there are a lot of good Democrats out there, and the ones who are running for president next time around are making a lot of good noises. They're talking about things like monopolies. You know, all these monopolistic companies out there, they're talking about what's happened to the middle class in this country, things that, frankly, they should have been talking about in 2016.
That's 2020. Very quickly, for 2018, is it enough to just be the party not of Trump?
Oh, it might work. I mean, the midterms are, a time when people are primed to vote against the ruling party. So that might pay off in the short term. In the long term, no.
Thomas Frank, it's great to see you as always. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thomas Frank, the book again is Rendezvous with Oblivion, Reports from a Sinking Society.